I am Dr. Rapp, and this is Appreciating Shakespeare, Series 2, Podcast P, Richard III. Richard III is the fourth play in the first of Shakespeare's two tetralogies on English history. It records the rise and fall of the brilliant but deformed and villainous Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Brazen and subtle, he labors to eliminate all the Lancastrian, Red Rose, and Yorkist, White Rose, claimants that stand between himself and the throne until he is crowned Richard III. Unintentionally serving as a scourge of God, Richard purges England of the thoroughgoing political corruption and consequent civil wars that have characterized it since the original sin of the justifiable but tragic deposing of Richard II. The purge is completed with Richard's own death. The defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field is accomplished by Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Henry marries Elizabeth, the great-great-granddaughter of Edmund Langley, Duke of York. He thereby unites the houses of Lancaster and York. In assuming the throne as Henry VII, he puts an end to the Wars of the Roses and establishes the royal house of Tudor. It was his granddaughter, Elizabeth I, who was England's monarch when the play was performed. Even audiences wowed by the three Henry VI plays would have been astonished by the compelling power of Richard III. In addition to its more sophisticated poetic style and its fast-moving plot, the character of Richard is both a thoroughly Machiavellian demon of immoral self-interest and a clever, subtle, and highly entertaining wit. We are elated and entertained by his brilliance, even as we are horrified by his evil. He prefigures both Iago in Othello and Macbeth. Shakespeare had begun to develop that character of Richard in the soliloquies of Henry VI, Part 3, when Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III, considers, at Act 3, Scene 2, lines 128 to 131, that between my soul's desire, that is the crown, and me is Clarence, Richard's older brother, Henry, descendant of John of Gaunt and future Henry VII, and Edward IV's young son Edward, briefly later Edward V, and all the unlooked-for issue of their bodies, meaning their offspring. At lines 148 to 163 of the same scene, Richard contemplates his own body, rejecting the idea of finding heaven in a lady's lap. Oh, miserable thought, and more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns! Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and did corrupt frail nature with some bribe to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back, where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part, like to a chaos. And am I then a man to be beloved? These characteristics of Richard's body, hunchback, withered arm, unequal legs that caused him to limp, like Richard's wit and capacity for deceit, Shakespeare inherits from his sources. They were John Rouse's Historia Regum Angliae, the history of the kings of England, Polydore Virgil's Anglicae Historiae, English history, and Thomas More's History of King Richard III, all of which were redacted in various ways and read by Shakespeare in Edward Hall's Union of the Two Noble and Illustrate Families of Lancaster and York, 1548, and in Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, 1587. These sources were themselves based on long-standing tradition among earlier writers on Richard. Rouse reports that Richard was born with teeth, referred to in Henry VI, Part 3, Act 5, Scene 6, line 75, and in Richard III, Act 4, Scene 4, line 49. that Richard was 2 years in his mother's womb before birth, and that he had uneven shoulders. More describes Richard as little of stature, ill-featured of limbs, crook-backed. From Moore, Shakespeare also inherited the idea that Richard's deformities were external representations of his inner character. To quote Anthony Hammond's introduction in the Arden edition, Moore had set out to present his tyrant in a satiric light, maximizing his villainy, but treating it always with irony and detachment. Shakespeare preserves the villainy and increases the irony, brilliantly injecting the latter into the character of Richard himself. In lines 165 to 168 of the same soliloquy from Henry VI, Part 3, quoted earlier, Richard turns from considering what he cannot enjoy to what he does enjoy. Then, since this earth affords no joy to me, but to command, to check, to o'erbear such as are of better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown. Like Macbeth later, he wants to be the ultimate commander, the king. In lines 182 to 193, Richard goes on to revel in his gift for duplicity by comparing himself to a list of classical archetypes of betrayal and one important modern one. Why, I can smile and murder whiles I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall, I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon, take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Here are some glosses on the classical archetypes referred to in this speech. The mermaid is a reference to the sirens, whose singing draws sailors to their death in Homer's Odyssey, Book 12. The basilisk was a serpent that could kill by merely looking at its victim. Nestor was the oldest of the kings that sailed to Troy to recover Helen. Homer mentions, and Ovid reinforces, Nestor's gift for oratory in Homer's Iliad, Book 2, line 372, Book 4, line 293, and other places, and in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 12, line 63. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus, in Latin Ulysses, was famed for his wiles and inventiveness. Sinon is a double agent who, in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid, convinces the Trojans to accept the fatal horse into the city, because of which Troy was finally captured and destroyed. The chameleon, or chameleon, as noted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 15, lines 411 to 412, as well as in modern science, is famously able to change its colors to disguise itself in its environment. In Homer's Odyssey, Book 4, lines 365 to 570, Proteus, a minor sea god with prophetic powers, also known as the Old Man of the Sea, could change his shape when captured. The modern archetype, Machiavel, is Machiavelli, already thought of in England at this time as the incarnation of amorality in the name of self-serving political gain, as I discussed in Session 4 of Chapter 7 in Series 1. To set to school means Richard is claiming to be able to teach Machiavelli a thing or two about murder for political expediency. At lines 194 to 195, Richard concludes the speech thus: "Can I do this, and cannot get a crown? Were it further off, I'd pluck it down." That sound, the click signifying disapproval, which we might spell TSK, is spelled TUT in the early editions of Shakespeare. Richard's character is thus already present in Henry VI, Part 3. What remains to be told is the story of how that character achieves his successful rise and meets his inevitable fall. That rise and fall are the business of the highly rhetorical tragedy of Richard III. The play is almost all in verse, the one significant exception being the conversation of the two murderers of Clarence in Act 1, Scene 4. The verse is almost all end-stopped lines, as is characteristic of the early period of Shakespeare's work. And the use of rhetorical devices, as in the other plays of Shakespeare's early period, is elaborate and obvious, indeed almost operatic. An example is the Threnody in Act 4, Scene 4, in which the old Queen Margaret, widow of Henry VI, the Duchess of York, mother of the three brothers Edward IV, George Duke of Clarence, and Richard III, and Queen Elizabeth, widow of Edward IV, lament those whom Richard has murdered on his way to the throne. The use of rhetoric is not merely decorative. The rhetorical elaboration serves the multi-layered purposes of the drama, conveying information and argumentation, logos, attitude, ethos, and emotional power, pathos, all to serve the total experience of meaning. Logos, ethos, and pathos are the three divisions of rhetoric according to Aristotle. For example, in Act 1, Scene 2, Richard, who has just murdered Henry VI and the prince his son, heir to the throne, woos the Lady Anne, the prince's widow. He does so in the presence of the dead body of the king he has killed, her father-in-law, even as, in keeping with the folklore tradition, the wounds of the murdered bleed again in the presence of the murderer. And amazingly to us and to himself, Richard succeeds in that wooing. Alone again, Richard says to the audience at lines 227 to 229, "Was ever woman in this humour wooed? Was ever woman in this humour won? I'll have her, but I will not keep her long." One can enumerate the rhetorical devices in these three lines: anaphora, antithesis, assonance, consonance, alliteration, diacope, erotesis, isocolon, meiosis, and so on. But the repetitions, rhetorical questions, and balanced antitheses of have and not keep are more than punctuation. By their very nature they convey the combination of glee and murderous self-glorification that are the essence of Richard's character. In a sense, Richard is seducing us, the audience, even as he seduces Lady Anne, and even as we retain awareness of his thoroughly evil will. The play is also built upon a series of parallel but contrasting scenes: the turning against Hastings, Act 3, Scene 4, with the turning against Buckingham, Act 4, Scene 2, the successful wooing of Lady Anne, Act 1, Scene 2, with the failed wooing of Elizabeth for her daughter, Act 4, Scene 4, the dream of Clarence before his death, Act 1, Scene 4, and the dream of Richard before his death, Act 5, Scene 3, the ghost's appearance to Richard and then to Richmond in Act 5, Scene 3, and one by one the characters of the drama discover Richard's perfidy and fall away. Richard is given also a series of highly theatrical performance bits. In the first wooing scene, he hands Lady Anne a sword pointed toward his own breast and invites her either to kill him or to marry him, Act 1, Scene 2. He disarmingly sends the Bishop of Ely out of the room for strawberries before re-entering in a rage and ordering the execution of Hastings, Act 3, Scene 4. In a moment I'll return to those strawberries in specific note 1. He repeatedly avoids Buckingham's request for a promised reward for his help, Act 4, Scene 2, an exchange to which I will return in specific note 2 in a few moments. He plays at religious piety for the London crowd by having Buckingham beg him to take up the crown and pretending to resist out of holy humility, Act 3, Scene 7. His smarmy pseudo-religiosity in that scene, at lines 219 to 220, is exquisite. Buckingham: "Come, citizens, Zounds, I'll entreat no more. Richard. Oh, do not swear, my Lord of Buckingham. Himself a cheerful breaker of at least 8 of the 10 commandments, he pretends to be offended at Buckingham's taking the name of the Lord in vain. The exclamation pronounced by stage tradition, zounds, more probably originally zoons, is an oath, a shortened form of by his, meaning Christ's, wounds. The play also makes repeated use of prophecies and omens. Richard has spread it around that G will murder the heirs of Edward IV, Act 1, Scene 1, lines 39 to 40, and uses it to do away with his brother, George, Duke of Clarence, whose name begins with the letter G. The prophecy comes true when Richard himself, Duke of Gloucester, which also begins with the letter G, becomes the murderer. Clarence dreams of drowning in the sea before he awakes and is actually drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, Act 1, Scene 4. Richard reports on a prophecy about Richmond that plays on the name of a castle called Rougemont, Act 4, Scene 2, lines 103 to 107. The many bitter prophecies of the old Queen Margaret, Act 1, Scene 3, all come true. The Duchess of York utters curses on her son that also come true, Act 4, Scene 4, lines 184 to 196. Dramatic ironies are repeatedly present in the fates of nearly every member of the court, including Hastings, Buckingham, the brothers of Queen Elizabeth, the young princes, and Richard himself. By the end of Richard III, all the prophecies of the corruption of England that John of Gaunt will utter in Richard II, written later, remember, have been fulfilled. The extremely well-constructed plot and evocative power of Richard III take shape in a masterful combination of elements that Shakespeare inherited from Senecan tragedy, from the revenge play tradition, from the medieval and earlier Renaissance morality play and its vice character, from the influence of Machiavelli, and from the Christian belief in the perennial likelihood of the appearance on earth of the, or the spirit of, or an Antichrist. The sources for the latter are the first epistle of John, chapter 2, verse 22, and chapter 4, verse 3, and the second epistle of John, verse 7. All these elements are joined with vitality into the twofold nature of Richard, thoroughly deceitfully evil, and at the same time thrillingly witty, inventive, and therefore attractive. As easily as he seduces the Lady Anne, he wins over the audience, though our seduction is subtler and dawns on us more slowly. And it happens even as we are perfectly aware of Richard's demonic villainy. In making Richard attractive to us, Shakespeare implicates us, along with every Englishman on the stage, in the drama of good versus evil. Then, having revealed the war between good and evil to be within us as psychomachia, as well as outside us in the world, he shows us in Richard's fall the inevitable catastrophe fated to those whose self-worship remains unrepented. Its names are despair, death, and damnation. Now here are 5 key lines. Key line 1. Part of what makes the character of Richard so compelling is that he repeatedly tells us, in soliloquies and asides, what he is and what he is doing. I am determined to prove a villain, Act 1, Scene 1, line 30. If I fail not in my deep intent, Clarence hath not another day to live, Act 1, Scene 1, lines 149 to 150. I'll have her, but I will not keep her long, Act 1, Scene 2, line 229. And thus I clothe my naked villainy with odd old ends stolen forth of Holy Writ, and seem a saint when most I play the devil. Act 1, Scene 3, lines 335 to 337. I am in so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin. Tear-falling pity dwells not in this eye. Act 4, Scene 2, lines 63 to 65. I shall despair, Act 5, Scene 3, line 200. Key line 2. Richard says a sentence that belongs in the list I just gave you in key line 1. I separate it out here because it calls for a bit more attention. At Act 3, Scene 1, lines 82 to 83, Richard says, in an aside to the audience, "Thus, like the formal vice iniquity, I moralize two meanings in one word." The first meaning is in Richard's immediately previous aside. "So wise, so young, they say, do never live long," line 79, implying that he is already contemplating the murder of the princes. The second meaning he speaks aloud. "I say, without characters, fame lives long," line 81. That is, even without written records, fame will live on. The one word of two meanings is the phrase, live long. The doubleness of the two meanings is perceived only by the audience. To moralize is also used in two senses. A, literally, the phrase means to find in a phrase the moral or symbolic meaning that is different from its literal meaning. In this case, the moral meaning of live long in line 81 is directly opposite to the literal meaning implied in line 79. Precocious boys do not live long. Fame does live long. B, to moralize suggests a reference to the older morality plays, in which the character called the Vice, who embodied all vices and was sometimes named Iniquity, drove the plot. Here, formal means conventional or typical, referring to the stock character of the Vice in the old morality plays. Anthony Hammond, quoting Bernard Spivack, writes, "In the earlier moralities, the several vices which afflict mankind were individually personified. In the mid-16th century, a single representative figure of evil came to be called the Vice, who acquired distinctive theatrical personality and status far beyond the allegorical features. He is homiletic showman, intriguer extraordinary, and master of dramatic ceremonies. He displays the trick of tears and laughter. His weeping feigns his affection and concern for his victim. His laughter, for the benefit of the audience, declares the triumph of his subtle fraud and his scorn for the puny virtue of humanity." Compare with Richard the references to the Vice in Twelfth Night, Act 4, Scene 2, line 124, in Henry IV, Part 1, Act 2, Scene 4, line 453, and in Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 4, line 98. Shakespeare makes of Richard more than merely a morality play vice. He is also a kind of devil, an antichrist figure, and a scourge of God. But his tone and style come from the morality play tradition. Key line 3. In Act 4, Scene 2, after spreading the rumor that the boys are illegitimate, Richard proposes murdering the two sons of his brother, Edward IV, who take precedence over Richard as heirs to the throne. In Act 4, Scene 3, at lines 2 to 3, the murderer, Tyrrell, who has arranged for the murder of the boys, calls it the most arch deed of piteous massacre that ever yet this land was guilty of. This is in keeping with the general attitude of Shakespeare's England that infanticide is one of the worst imaginable crimes. The same attitude stands behind the intended effect of the murder of the family of Macduff in Macbeth, Act 4, Scene 2, lines 83 to 84, and Act 4, Scene 3, lines 193 to 219. The language of these passages confirms the principle of J.V. Cunningham that foreground is background, which I discussed in Session 5 of Chapter 7 in Series 1. Shakespeare has his characters express explicitly the background attitudes needed for the audience to appreciate the point. Key line 4. In Act 5, Scene 3, on the night before the last battle, the ghosts of Henry VI, his son Prince Edward, Clarence, Rivers, Grey, Vaughan, the two young princes, Hastings, and Buckingham, all appear successively to Richard in his dream, and then to Richmond in his, cursing the former and encouraging the latter. The curse on Richard by all is despair and die. When Richard awakens, he accuses himself, shows he is aware of all his crimes, realizes that all his sins cry guilty, line 199. But at no point then or later in battle does he repent. The curse of the ghosts is therefore entirely fulfilled in the ultimate and theologically complete damnation of Richard's soul. Richard says, "I myself find in myself no pity to myself," lines 202 to 203. That is, there is nothing in him that can desire forgiveness or ask for it. This is the literal meaning of despair, the conviction that one's soul cannot be saved even by God. In Richard's case, there is nothing in him that can even want to be saved. The only possible consequence of this condition is damnation. Shakespeare will bring the same condition to an even higher pitch in the end of the tragedy of Macbeth. Key line 5. In Act 5, Scene 4, lines 7 and 13, Richard's last line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," is a complex fabric of rhetorical devices, including alliteration, antithesis, assonance, consonance, diacope, ellipsis, epanalepsis, epimony, epizeuxis, hyperbole, meiosis, optatio, and simplicy. Yet it strikes us with powerfully direct simplicity. Its great significance lies in its meiosis, a reduction through the use of a small or low term for a great or high thing, which is both rhetorical and thematic. Having given up everything of value, family, friends, love, honor, virtue, and his own soul, in order to achieve the kingdom, Richard is now desperately willing to give up his kingdom for a mere horse. This meiosis is Shakespeare's brilliant embodiment in Richard and in a line of verse of the principle of all his history plays. To this pathetic end must come all pretensions to rule that divorce themselves from the universal moral principles of virtue and commitment to the common good. Now here are the two promised specific notes to help with your reading. Specific note 1. When Richard sends the Bishop of Ely for strawberries, the audience is no doubt meant to be aware of some such proverb as this from Paradin's Historical Devises of 1591. In the gathering of flowers and strawberries that grow low upon the ground, we must be very careful for the adder and snake that lieth lurking in the grass. Specific note 2. In Act 4, Scene 2, to secure himself on the throne, Richard asks Buckingham to consent in the deaths of Richard's nephews, the sons of Edward IV, Edward V, right heir to the throne, and his younger brother York. The proposal is an outrage, and Buckingham wants to think it over. Buckingham's hesitation turns Richard against him. Later in the scene, Buckingham asks Richard for the earldom of Hereford, which Richard had promised him in return for his help, at Act 3, Scene 1, lines 194 to 195. Richard ignores Buckingham 4 times. The 5th time, Richard asks, "What's o'clock?" meaning what time is it? And when Buckingham repeats his request again, Richard repeats the question. Act 4, Scene 2, lines 109 to 111. When Buckingham says, "Upon the stroke of 10, Richard replies, "Well, let it strike." Buckingham doesn't understand and asks why. Richard then says, "Because that like a jack thou keep'st the stroke betwixt thy begging and my meditation. I am not in the giving vein today." When Richard says, "Thou troublest me, I am not in the vein," line 118, Buckingham realizes he is doomed to die at Richard's hands and leaves him. In the automaton striking clocks of the Renaissance, the jack was the small human figure that swiveled to strike the bell on the hour. Richard is saying that Buckingham's repeated request is like the repeated clockwork striking of the bell. Let it strike probably means let it complete its striking of the hour and stop. In short, stop nagging me. There is also a pun on jack meaning lout or ill-mannered knave. I am Dr. Rapp, and this is Appreciating Shakespeare.